Hello, everybody. I'm gonna give it a second to let you guys all trickle in. Welcome everyone to our second webinar here at Prevalent of the year. We have a really exciting one today with an incredible panel, and we're gonna focus on ethics, compliance, and diversity. There's going to be no presentation. It's going to be a panel only video discussion, and we're going to all chit chat about obviously ethics, compliance, and diversity. And I'd like to just go over a couple of housekeepings for everybody. We are muting everyone. We can't see you either, but we also are recording the session. I want you guys to also please do the Q&A in the bottom. We want this to be interactive. Ask as many questions as you possibly can or want for the panel. And as far as the recording, you'll get it in your inbox tomorrow. That's it from me. I'm going to go over the list of panelists and walk you through who's going to be joining. Oh, this is Amanda, by the way, for Prevalent. I'm the host. Forgot to mention that. So we have Alpa Imadar. She's the head of third-party governance advisory group at BNY Mellon. Alpa is responsible for strategic planning, organizational restructuring, client relationship management, compliance, and risk. She oversees the strategy and execution of cross-functional transition plans for new business opportunities and high-profile complex initiatives for existing clients. Over her career tenure, she has a successful track record as a leader in managing complex client relationships, risk management, and transformation. Welcome, Alpa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Of course. And we also have Tracy Davis. She is a partner in Seyfarth Shaw's New York office in the firm's commercial litigation department and global privacy and cybersecurity team. A highly seasoned litigator, she represents corporate clients in breach of fiduciary duty, deceptive business practices, and complex contract disputes, both in and out of court, and arbitration and mediation. Whew, this is a mouthful. Okay, she is also certified information privacy professional who is experienced in creating legal frameworks and advising emerging market stakeholders, board directors, and C-suite executives on regulatory compliance and litigation risk mitigation and navigating the ever-changing landscape of fintech, AI, and ESG. Welcome, Tracy Davis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Amanda.
Sorry if I butchered a couple of those words, but we know.
No worries.
And last but not least, of course, the one and only Brenda Ferraro, our VP of Third-Party Risk at Prevalent. She will be our moderator and asking these fierce ladies important questions for you guys to listen in and pay attention to. So with that said, Brenda, all you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. You did a good job.
Thank you.
So Tracy and Alpa, I am so happy to have you here today. We're going to be talking about a very hot, important topic that seems to be bubbling into everyone's email inbox and forthright future to talk about, where it's ESG for environmental, social, and governance, along with ethics and diversity and compliance. And how does that really relate to third party? You know, we've been working so very hard to make sure that we're collecting information on our third parties, maybe even into the nth party, on cybersecurity or business or financial, but now the scope has totally increased. We are now looking at so much more. So I have some questions that I'm going to be bouncing off the two of you, and we'll be talking about strategies and any information. But before we do that, I have a legal disclaimer because we do have a legal resource on the line. So I'm going to read that real quick before we get started for another housekeeping item. And then we'll come back to the questions. So as far as our discussion today, our legal disclaimer is that the participants are speaking in their personal capacities only and not on the behalf of their employer or clients. The content of this presentation is intended for general information purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. So now with that regular program, I feel like I should have said that a lot faster. You know how the radio shows are blah, 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 blah. All right, so the first question that I have, I'm going to focus on towards Tracy. So, with the increased focus that we were talking about on diversity and inclusion, driven by the market's attention to ESG factors, what is the current state of the legal environment that public and private corporations and their boards now face when it comes to ESG generally, and more specifically, diversity and inclusion?
So it's a good question to jump this conversation off with because of just the sheer breadth of ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it includes a whole array of various factors that looks to target stakeholders within an entity as well as within the market. And why it's so important to now understand what the landscape looks like is because that landscape is very young and there aren't many regulations and rules, particularly here in the US. Much like in the early stages of cyber, currently the stages in privacy, it's an ad hoc approach that the US has elected to take where it's a hands-off as far as specific regulations that govern E, S, and G. Well, what drives ES and ESG? What drives it is data. What drives it is metrics. What drives it is goals and targets. And right now, where we presently stand, there is no uniform targets. There are no uniform goals. And so we're playing somewhat of a game of catch up, whereas just recently the EU, which has historically had a knee-deep framework for measuring and utilizing the data when it comes to environmental issues, has been, almost at the forefront of adopting the UN sustainability standards. Whereas the US has taken somewhat of a hands-off approach, but it cannot be a hands-off approach any longer. And we're seeing that by regulations. For example, the SEC just recently made proposals on human capital and what needs to be disclosed as far as listed companies' human resources. While that sounds like not much, because really it's taken a less prescriptive approach and just said whatever is material to a company's functioning is the benchmark. That's a head and shoulders from where we were once at one point in time. With respect specifically to diversity in that area, NASDAQ has just recently proposed a rule that says any company listed on its exchange has to have a diverse board. Hopefully, and it's likely that that rule is going to be implemented because various states around the US have adopted comparable benchmarks. It says that by the first year after implementation, you have to have at least one woman on the board. And by year 2, you have to have at least 2 diverse people, 1 woman and 1 diverse. And depending upon the size, the 1 woman, it may be sufficient to meet that threshold. But again, it's with those kinds of standards that we're looking to get at least some goals that are uniformly established in this space. We were, before jumping on, we talked about BlackRock and Larry Fink just recently making it a mandate that any companies that BlackRock does business with has to meet the sustainability metrics that have been voluntarily proliferated. And we'll talk a little bit later on about what that proliferation of a voluntary standard means in a legal context. But just suffice it to say for now that we're talking about an environment where it is slowly evolving. And we'll also talk about the risks, because where you don't necessarily have a specific set of regulations or laws, it expands the possibility for exposure and risks. We in the compliance space, we like set laws, we like regulations. As a litigator, I can tell you the law certainly knows how to make up for those areas where there are no prescriptive standards. But hopefully that answers your question, Brenda.
It does. It does. Thank you so much. Very well said. And I like how you put that it's young. And being that it's going to possibly be a Herculean event, Alpa, what are you doing at BNY Mellon, or in your expert opinion should be looked at in order to address what we're facing?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I'll agree with what Tracy just said, right? I mean, we don't have specific regulations and laws. We're still, as we call, evolving. Some industry more than others, but I can talk about financial industry, right? I think now the board is making the organization accountable from a strategic perspective, right? So we are now looking at the company culture and saying, as we bring in these suppliers or vendors, are we making sure that vendors in the chain management are having the diverse, either it's 100% women owned, either it's small businesses, either it's different ethnicity, either it's, looking at Modern Slavery Act. So I think now we have specific metrics. Again, each industry, we don't have a standard as of yet, as Tracy talked about. But in the financial industry, I think we are getting more and more evolved in a sense of measuring against some of these criteria. Either it's environmental, either it's climate, either it's CO2 emissions. All of these criteria we're now evolving, and we want to do business based on these data sets where we're saying we'll only operate and we'll have to be 360 on our suppliers, right? It can't be, I've had relationship with X vendor for 50 years and not really doing our due diligence and making sure that they meet the ESG and the ethic, compliance, and diversity criteria.
Very well said. So I think I'm going to jump. It may feel like it's a little off kilter from what we just talked about, but it's still connected in my mind. So Alpa, I'll pose this question to you first. Where does continuous monitoring fit into ethics and compliance and diversity and ESG, everything that we just talked about?
Sure. Well, I'll take a first second and talk about continuous monitoring first, and then we can kind of deep dive into the ethics and compliance diversity. Pre-COVID, if you think about how the third-party governance was managing or the risk was, when we would onboard a client, we would do our due diligence based on the risk assessments, right? So if they were high, moderate, low, based on that criticality, we would do we will do an assessment either every year, every other year, every 3 years, right? Now, given the COVID, everything kind of accelerated that path. So what you knew a year ago or 2 years ago isn't good enough to do the business because of the companies, either depending where the concentration, their location was, their financial viability, their operational risk. So continuous monitoring played an amazing or very critical role in understanding risk, which means we wanted to see real-time alerts, right? We had to monitor these vendors, not periodically, not when we are onboarding, but continuously. Now we take the subset, and the question you asked, Brenda, is how do we do continuous monitoring with ethics, compliance, and diversity? So now we started really auditing and looking at all the inventory of our vendors, really start looking at the criminal conduct, right? Started thinking about, what are the transactions that we are occurring, and are we reviewing those transactions, and do they meet the criteria for ethics, compliance, and diversity? So I think it's now starting to put specific metrics, measuring those metrics, and then being consistent, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges, especially in the financial industry, is you've been there, Bank of New York Mellon, 233 years old, legacy systems, infrastructure. How do we make sure we have consistency? So I think those are some of the things we're looking at continuous monitoring. Again, ideally, if I would look at it, future state is you would have proper regulations and laws and metrics that we get measured. But right now, I think each company is kind of trying to evolve and think what actually is their risk appetite, and then coming up with the metrics that affiliate with that industry. Tracy, I don't know. Do you agree with some of that, or?
I agree 100% with you, Alpa. The monitoring piece is what helps to protect against exposure from liability when the issues come up much later down the road. You'll find that right now there are at least 8 lawsuits that are pending against corporations for their diversity and inclusion inactivity, okay? And while they have standards and practices and policies and programs that range from, pay equity to, anti-discrimination to, how they vet third-party vendors, having those policies don't do much unless they are actually implemented and practiced. And it's the monitoring and what that data provides you with that is the guardrail between exposure to liability if in the event there is a similar kind of claim brought, and not being and we'll talk about the levels of liability that exists on the back end, but you're absolutely right, Alpa. It is through that monitoring and the expectation of the market. The market now has the capacity to do real-time data analyses, and they're doing it through the rating and ranking agencies. There are corporate profiles out there that are being utilized not only to assess shareholder value, but also to assess risk. So when you're looking at what kinds of third-party vendors you want to engage in, it is worthwhile doing that kind of due diligence that would involve analytics.
So speaking of litigation, the next question actually is about that. I don't know how you teed me up because it was great. So with so little regulatory and legal guidance specifically tailored to ESG disclosures, what type of risk mitigation strategies and litigation avoidance tactics can be used by the corporations in the audience which want to remain competitive in the ESG space?
So it starts with an overall assessment. You have to look at your overall through the 360, look at the overall structure of the corporation itself, starting from the board through senior management, all the way down to workers as well as third-party vendors, to see exactly where you presently stand with respect to diversity, what kinds of diverse individuals are occupying those senior roles. Right now, the focus is only on boards, but I can tell you that I attended the World Economic Forum last year, and Jamie Dimon, I hate to mention a competitor at this point, but was specific in saying that his intention was to look not only top down, but vertical as well, to see who in the supply chain was meeting the standards and commitments. And that's critically important. It's important that you do that 360 so that you know your organization, you know where your organization stands, not only vis-a-vis its suppliers, but vis-a-vis your competitors. It's not a one size fits all, so it does require this broad, deep analysis to see where you stand with respect to the industry that you're in, your competition, your size. Obviously, that will factor into any analysis as to what efforts are being undertaken as far as diversity and inclusion, your employee practices, how you handle claims of discrimination. Doing that 360 is the first step. The second step is for you then to look at your policies and practices. Do they need to be modified? How are they being implemented? Who's responsible for the implementation? You will see that more and more there's chief sustainability officers. Why? Because that means that the responsibility for accountability is housed in one person. Those factors are critical when it comes to making certain that you guard the institution from these claims. The monitoring, which we already talked about, looking and being knowledgeable about the industry standards. Where there is no law, those industry standards become even more critical. Those are just some of the factors and mechanisms that can be employed to protect, documentation, data is your friend, as long as you're keeping a mindful eye on that data and you don't have any inconsistencies between what you say you're doing and what the numbers prove you're actually doing. So those are just some areas, but it's a full panoply of techniques that can be utilized and must, because I don't think that there is any company or industry that's not susceptible now, given the prevalence and BlackRock.
So I like the way that you put the 1, 2, 3 together. Alpa, do you have some to add, or do you?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, just one, I think, quick data set, right? ESG in 2018, I think, was 30 trillion, okay? And it's going to get the revenue that we go from it, and it's going to be 50 trillion over the next 20 years. So as what Tracy was stating, right, this is going to be critical for any industry. By ESG is going to be how we monitor, how we analyze, and how we participate. The other thing, what I've noticed, what Tracy was talking about, is our investors, our clients, and even our employees are asking, how is our organization being part of ESG? It's not just good enough to be able to voluntarily or giving, right? It's about investing properly. So are we investing in ETFs that are ESG focused? And that's where I think the mindset is changing towards, right? Because companies, when they're hiring for employees, they're asking, how are you giving back? What are you doing on ESG space, which is very different 10 years ago. So I think it's being able to not just do it for your employees, but it's to be able to sustain our society. We have to start focusing on ESG and how we manage that process.
Great.
I just want to add one thing, because I think that there's a mental framework that you can use to sort of think about this topic. And it's important to understand that corporations under the law are viewed as individuals. They're viewed as people. So, what's happening now with ESG, they're just really elevating them to be responsible members of society. So it's really important to just use that as an anchor when you look at some of these factors.
Great point made, Tracy. Couldn't agree with you more. I love that, what you just said. That's amazing.
It is. All right, so we're going to talk about the broader scope of, you talked about the individual and being accountable. Well, we've got this supply chain that just is expanding. We used to just have to look at suppliers that were providing cybersecurity type handling and hosting. And now in some of our organizations and industries, we're branching out. And so with that supply chain expanding past cybersecurity into nth party assessments, where it's I'm working with a vendor, that vendor's working with another vendor on the same engagement, that vendor's now working with another one. It's like a domino effect. Since that has become the hot topic, and we're really looking at resiliency and stabilization factors, and what are those risk components drivers that will give us the clear visibility into those partnerships and that long chain of support or that landscape. How are you, Alpa, handling the increase or contractual nature of both of those when it comes to something so stringently assessed, or even have to discover of what we've been doing in the past versus what we need to be doing now?
Yeah, look, I think the whole landscape, like you said, has changed. And I will say a lot of it has accelerated because of COVID, right? And we have actually been impacted. Either it's something basic as a toilet paper, right? How, what the supply chain and the impact it had to everybody. So I think, look, as an organization now, it's not good enough just to know your third party, but like you said, the nth party, because there's a significant impact, because like you said, it's a domino or a ripple effect. So one of the things we've started looking at is, really just changing our policies, our contracts, right? Where now in the past, we never have asked, who are your fourth parties or your fifth parties? But now one step further, where are those fourth parties and fifth parties based out of, right? Because the location does make a difference. Then we're going one step further within those parties. What's the diversity mix, right? Because now we are being accountable. I will say EMEA has, because of the regulations, they're now asking us, tell us what your nth party is, showcase out of those, how many are based out of cloud, right? So I think I will say EMEA is a little bit advanced compared to US, But being a global organization, I think what we're doing is rather than waiting for the regulators, we are globally changing this process. So I think look, we're doing extra due diligence. We're changing our contractual process. We are also changing the way how we do due diligence in general, right? So it's not just good enough to saying, hey, I know my vendor and long as they can provide an X service, it's good enough. It's, are the vendors following the code of conduct that you agree with, right? And are they then trickling down to their fourth and fifth and sixth parties? And are they doing that same due diligence? Because in the past, I can honestly saying, well, listen, I only know my third parties. I don't know what they do with the fourth. So I'm out of that mix and I'm not accountable. Now the accountability lies in with these nth party. So look, I think we're being very stringent. We are now being, again, doing extra due diligence, understanding the risk that it can pose based on where we do our performance of that service, and then understand it. Because I will tell you, when the COVID hit, when we had to send out a surveys, we had no idea where the concentration risk was lying, because this is the first time it affected all countries and regions. It wasn't New York centric like 9/11. It wasn't centric on a hurricane that happened either in Philippines or in US or somewhere else. It affected us all. So I think this has accelerated the path, and now we are being more and more accountable for the parties that we actually provide services to us.
That's really well said. And Tracy, the one thing that I think about that you might be able to opine a little bit from a legal perspective is what I used to hear when I was doing assessments back in the day. They would say, well, we're not liable for those vendors that, they do their own assessments. So how do we address that?
So it's a really good question, Brenda, because ALPA's focus on contracts, that's really where the protection lies. If you don't have a really strong contract management and look at those standard provisions that usually you often just gloss over, it is where you find either protection or exposure to liability. So, what do you do? Not only do you take a look at, indemnification clauses, but you look at the strength of your third party vendors, your nth vendors, because, when it comes to a lawsuit, they're just looking for whoever has the deepest pocket. So you'll get swept up. Indemnification provisions, knowing you're doing that due diligence. Right now the ESG has not bubbled up, but I can tell you that the FTC looked to hold a purchaser of a third-party vendor liable for their failure to have met the privacy statements that purchaser had adopted. And where those third-party vendors are relying on artificial intelligence, which has a whole host of other risks embedded in and of themselves, they are going to look to the supply, to the purchaser to determine whether or not that purchaser has done the due diligence that's required, that has done the constant monitoring and assessment of that tool to see whether or not that tool is violative of the end user's rights and entitlements. So it means, just as Alpa said, that the due diligence is critically important, knowing who they are and what they're doing and whether or not they meet your own code of ethics. All of those are what are critically important in this environment. More laws will come, believe me. It's just that until then, there's still exposure, there's still risk of liability. And what has to happen is going back to the very basics.
That's one of our marketing's phrases that they love, is go back to the basics.
Yeah, it's the truth.
So speaking of the increase of the vendor population into the nth tier, and with the increase of that, there comes the increase of AI in the human resource space. So, as well as a multitude of other places that you were talking about, what's the current state of the law in the US, and what are the legal risks and risk mitigation strategies that the companies on the line could impose or start to use?
So it's about it there. Let me just start off with the landscape. Unlike ESG in the US, there really is no guardrails. I mean, you look to data privacy policies and provisions. Whether it's on a state level or an industry specific level, you look to cyber regulations that many states now have adopted, as well as, federal as well as state regulatory agencies have adopted. And you look to see whether or not there's compliance on those fronts. So how is the data being stored? How is the data being used? But even there, with how that data is being used, there is a huge risk of exposure on just the efficacy of the AI software that's being used. So, for example, study after study, and it's widely known that there is a high risk of biased outcomes and of artificial intelligence, particularly where you're doing risk assessments or you're having, predictive analytics in making automated decisions. In that space, it's almost like it's a trifecta for a good class action lawsuit, because if it can be established that the software does in fact have biases and has biased outcomes, and that it's making critical decisions about lending for the end user, a consumer, that's where the exposure lies there, and that consumer is denied or deprived of an economic benefit or an opportunity. That's the classic deceptive practices class action lawsuit. And it doesn't matter that, the purchaser of that software, the user of AI, is unfamiliar with the application or its mechanics or how the data was populated. They are going to be held responsible for utilizing that service. So what can be done? There are now all sorts of there's all sorts of technology out there that does allow for the testing of that algorithm. There's a whole host of standards that require transparency for how that system operates. Testing is critically important in this space. Is it being routinely tested for disparate outcomes? Is it being monitored for what kinds of data is populating it? Garbage in, garbage out sort of principle. And if you don't take precautionary measures to see, well, how is that data being populated? Who's populating it? How is it being tested? All of those, it goes right back to due diligence. And so if you fail to take those proactive steps and you just blindly utilize AI, you're on the hook, you're exposed.
Yep, I agree. What do you think, Alpa?
No, I mean, look, I agree with Tracy. Look, AI is making significant inroads, right? And especially in lots of different sections, either it's in human resource side, either it's on the supply chain management side. But one of the things, like you said, the key critical is really understanding the data and the algorithms, right? Because if you don't do those accurately, there will be a significant impact from a legal perspective, reputational perspective, and then operation. One of the things that we are using AI, and most companies are, right? But again, we're using that for significant amount of volume of data, but still having human touch actually looking at that and analyzing it, right? So you have this second pair of eyes, really understanding to make sure that what we've actually programmed and the algorithms and the rules that are set up that are working efficiently. I also think, we're using them a lot on the HR space, where in the past, we forgot to notify the applicant. Significant issue, right? From a legal perspective, Tracy, that you would get all these people coming in saying, I wasn't notified that there was an AI approach and I was selected. Once the AI has been used from the video perspective on the interview, did you get the right consent from the applicant? And then more important, even after the applicant, is, did you destroy that once that process was done? And a lot of times the industry's like, well, we have the data, we didn't destroy it, or we couldn't evidence the destroy. aspect, and how many days is that? 30 days, 60 days. So I think, look, this is a great space. I think, like I said, it'll transform technology, but we have to be extremely cautious, like Tracy is saying, right? Because if we don't use this information accurately, there could be significant impact to the organization and industry. So again, as great as these technologies are, let's be very mindful how we use them. Make sure you understand the data, the algorithms, and the processes. And it can't be fully automated, right? You still need to have people analyze that information and give people enough, as I called, enough information and notification so people are aware what kind of data they're using.
Yeah, if you take it back to like the back to basics on third-party risk, you have sometimes platforms that can put configurations in and put some tags on and make adjustments and send out assessments for relevance, but you still have to have that human touch to make sure that you're applying the right ethics and you're not making decisions based on just responses coming back or continuous monitoring threat analysis that says, oh, this particular vendor is going to be risky because they've got all of this stuff that's happening in the wild. You pretty much have to say, from an ethical perspective, we're here to help you secure your security space. We know that this is out there. How can we fix it with you?
Right. Like I said, it's connecting the dots too, right? Because in isolation, that event could be triggered something. But if you think about holistically enterprise relationship with that vendor, it might not be, right? So I think it's also, like you said, how do you analyze that information? You take one snapshot and thinking it's a huge issue, or it could be vice versa. It might not be, and you have to come in with the human lens saying, this is our bread and butter, our core businesses, and this could significantly put us in jeopardy. So I think it's being able to have that. So I, agree with you, Brenda.
I want to just add one other thing that is critically important, and it just ties into Alpa's recognition that providing notification is critical. That notification needs to be in plain English, okay? It's not going to afford you the protection that you're looking for if it's incomprehensible. We've already been through this before with consumer financing and, the disclosure requirements there. We've already been through statutes that have already been on the books for quite some time that talks about the need for these notifications for notifications to consumers generally to be in plain English.
Agreed. And with that being said, so there's some situations that we've had to deal with regards to COVID, work from home being one of them. How does ethics, diversity, and compliance, or ESG, or what kind of techniques have we had to look out for based on that shift in the risk vector? So for work from home, what would you have, Alpa, to say about what we could be doing a little bit better, or even for the first time with regards?
We all had to adapt very quickly due to COVID, right? Everybody had to be working from home, right? It didn't matter if you were a trader or you were an analyst. So I think one is, quickly adapting, and do you have the right infrastructure to be able to do that? I think the second thing was just pure supply and demand. So I will tell you, some of our locations, we just didn't have enough laptops at the beginning of COVID, right? And we were literally, shipping desktops to different places just to be able for people to work from home. But once we got the hardware, I think it's being able to monitor the software and the people behind it, right? It's very, very challenging. And one of the things that I find, is we've now invested a lot more on some of these vendors that are looking at our IP addresses, that they're actually looking at, your day-to-day access. Are you touching sensitive data? And do we have the right protocols or additional security measurements, not just the RCSA token, but should APA really look at the data of all the trade settlements that occurred today, given the fact she's actually in third-party governance, right? Well, because APA used to be in the business, she had that access, but now she's in third-party governance. So I think it's really reevaluating from ground zero, looking at each of your individual employees, looking at their accesses and what they're actually utilizing. So I think that's back to the basics as we talked about. Second thing I think we learned about is, a lot of people use their personal laptops. Are these viruses, software updates, have they kept that on track? Because organizations now are putting themselves more at risk when people are using their personal laptops, and let's say they didn't buy the antivirus software or the anti-malware. So I think we need to be extra cautious in how we operate that. So I think one of the things we're doing is we're saying you cannot use your personal laptops. Everybody has to be in a company device. I think now the additional monitoring has kicked in, right? So we're now just not monitoring your VPN access, but all the softwares. In the past, when you were in the offices, it was very hard for people to take the data and share it. Now, because you're in your household, people have a little bit of reluctancy. It's very easy for somebody to take that information over the phone and talk to them. They can take a picture from their iPhones and be able to share it. So how do we make sure that the data that we're presenting, that we have additional screen filters? So when you are trying to take pictures, it will not allow you to take that information. So look, as an organization, we had to adapt very quickly in order to make sure that we protect the data we have and the risk affiliated with it. Are we there 100%? No, we're not. But the fact is we are all learning this very quickly. So as I call, drinking from the fire hose. But we are trying to utilize the much as possible. What are some of the technologies that we can use in order to prevent the risk that could potentially impact us as an organization?
How about you, Tracy, from a legal
perspective? So I'll go back to the basics again. Send out reminders of what good protocol, good information governance practices are. Also, do training, have top-down training. I know that within my organization, we all have mandatory training that has to happen by a date certain. Recognizing that there are some third parties who have protocols on exchanging information vis-a-vis personal devices. Knowing what those protocols are, where when we work with financial institutions, they don't even want data sent by us utilizing our personal devices. So being mindful as an attorney, obviously we handle confidential information, being mindful of who's present when you're utilizing and accessing that information. Make sure that that data, that to the extent that it is printed out, is kept with some sense of security, destruction of it when it's no longer needed. So we recommend just going right back to the basics, but it's encouraging to hear that assessments are being done. We are in a different environment. So that does call for doing another 360 to see exactly where things stand organizational wise.
And like you said, the training is so critical, right? Because now we have more opportunity for hackers, right? So even the basic phishing emails, right? You have a package order, you open the email and then they get your IP addresses. So being able to train the employees differently based on the current environment, because everybody's working from home, how do we make sure that you have secure, and how do we train them? So I think, like you said, Tracy, training is key critical, and you have to change that training, right? Yes. What you had a couple of years ago, you can't just reinstitute that. You need to change those processes, saying, what are some of the different ways people can attack your mainframe systems, or even, like you said, the softwares.
And let me just say, we're under extraordinary circumstances right now, and that will be factored in. But if, for example, your problem comes to the attention of an organization and it's left unaddressed for an extended period of time, that's when liability and exposure, because it's through knowledge and inaction that culpability and liability are often assessed.
So we have time probably for one more question, and I have two. So I'm going to combine them together because I want to give the panel the opportunity to answer questions from the audience. So I'm going to address it to Tracy first. What specific role do the boards play in the risk mitigation strategies? And then what claims can be asserted against those corporate boards?
So the corporate board and its structure are critical to our entire conversation because that's where the buck stops. They are the ultimate body that is held accountable for the acts of a corporation. I said that a corporation is really a fictitious person. So who's responsible for that fiction? It's the board of directors. All of it resides in them. They are going to be responsible for having the knowledge, the expertise, the undivided loyalty that's built into their panoply of fiduciary duties that they owe to the entity itself, as well as to the shareholders, that, the exercise of those duties are going to dictate exactly, well, what kind of mission is the corporation going to take? I mean, there's, with ESG and these what are called non-economic factors, there's a whole debate going on whether or not it's incongruent with the corporate mission to be profit driven to even adopt some of these factors. Well, with a publicly listed company, you're almost forced to do an analysis to see exactly how the bottom line is driven by diversity and inclusion, for instance. So, why is it critical? Because it is the board that has to make certain that management has devised and developed an overarching strategy, that where that strategy has been adopted, that there are policies and procedures to implement the strategy, to see to it that, those responsible are held account, those in management that are responsible are held accountable. So what's the incentive? Because if the board members individually fail to meet these duties, these fiduciary obligations of being knowledgeable, of being loyal, of overseeing what management is doing, if they fail in any way, they can be sued for breach of their fiduciary obligations. It sounds scary because it is scary. When I say they can be sued, I mean personally liable, where, their own personal assets are at stake. Now, there are mitigating factors. They talk about if you've ever heard the business judgment rule, that's a rule that says if you take a reasonable care to meet these fiduciary obligations, then even if you mess up and the decision turns out to be wrong, the court's not going to hold you liable because you were acting in the best interest of the corporation. However, it's always a gray area, did you act with, undivided loyalty to the corporation? Did you ask the right questions? Did you do enough due diligence? Did you make certain that you hired and retained the right management? Was the board composed of enough of the expertise that's needed to make informed decisions? And, so it's critically important that the board not only assess the organization, but it assesses itself to make certain that it has the wherewithal to meet those fiduciary obligations. D&O coverage is out there. Obviously, it provides some protection, but not all. There's exclusions there as well. So why do I say it's important that the board's role and involvement? Because they are ultimately going to be held responsible. There's some day-to-day decisions that the board of directors never need even be involved in because they're not responsible for the day-to-day. But I can tell you where it comes to ESG, when it comes to cybersecurity, data privacy, these are so critically important that they are now looking at having chief sustainability officers and making certain that they get periodic reporting on these factors and where the company stands in meeting those benchmarks.
Helpa, back to you.
Yeah, no, look, I couldn't agree with Tracy more, right? I think one of the things what I'm seeing is now there's much more board positions for ethics committee, right? Which wasn't there. I think it's having more CISOs come in because like I said, now board owns that accountability, and do they have the right talent or the people who can evaluate some of the cybersecurity risk or operational or compliance risk. So I think the board composition is changing because, like I said, they're accountable and they're saying is, wait a minute, I need somebody who can really understand the ethics, the cyber element of it, environmental risk, and that they can guide us to make sure that the company is following those processes. So I think it's, like I said, you'll see more and more board opportunities for all of risk and third party, and especially on ethics and diversity, because they're going to be accountable.
Great. And I see Amanda has popped on because it's time for Q&A. But before she does, sometimes I don't get the opportunity to say thank you to both of you for your wealth of knowledge. It has been a pleasure and an honor, and I can't wait to see what questions we have. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. This was incredible. We do have a poll question prior to the Q&A. I'm just going to throw it up for everybody to, participate in if possible. And it's going to say, are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in 2021? You heard here first the criticality of even continuous monitoring your vendors. So we even think about that when we're asking that kind of question as well. So I'll leave it up for a little while. The first question I had was from the beginning of the session. So it might sound a little like she's talking to you guys from the beginning, but this was from Dorothy Rodriguez. So Dorothy, if you're listening and if you want me to ask a different way, please chime in. But she said, 10 years ago, I worked in third-party risk management for a manufacturing company where these were our primary concerns. However, all of the manufacturing was done offshore. Is this discussing what is required for vendors in the US now, or moving to also new Encompass service industries as well? I don't know if anyone can get an idea of what she's asking, but this is what she asked.
Are you asking that the manufacturing might be a little bit ahead of the game? I assume, is that what they're going towards? It might be, right? Because look, each industry, if you think about healthcare industry versus financial industry versus automobile industry, we all have a very different trajectory and the impact, right? So manufacturing could have, again, I don't have the question clarification what they're going towards, but look, it is changing the journey and we see that now more than ever. So I think, look, it depends on the industry, but end of the day, we are all accountable, as it doesn't matter, industry agnostic. You need to understand what business you're operating, what location, and do you feel comfortable with the ethics, compliance, and diversity of how they run that business? That's how I would answer it based on the question that was portrayed.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully that helped Dorothy.
Tracy, it looks like Tracy has something to say.
Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
I would just add to Alpa's remarks that look to your industry. That's the guide. So I may not have been able to mention it during our talk, but those industry standards will be infused in the lawsuit. So, don't think that it's just voluntary, it's an aside, I can do it if I want to. Where there is no law and the court is looking to see whether or not you've somehow or another created a risky situation for the defendant such that it caused the defendant harm, they're going to look at the industry standards. So, while we may not be able to say here and now with definitiveness whether or not manufacturers being impacted by, ESG and diversity, look at your competitors, look at the industry standards, go to your, industry associations, and they will all have a position on this, in some form or another. And if it doesn't break down under ESG, look for discrimination, look for diversity. Those key words are critical under the ESG umbrella when we're talking about this topic.
Like what Tracy said, even the regulators, right? Because like you said, the regulators are also going to say within your industry peers, they're doing X. Are you aligned or are you complying with something similar? So it's not like, I think it's one step further than what Tracy said. It's look at your industry peers, look at what some of the consortiums, but the regulators are also going to come to you by seeing the best practices within that industry and then making sure that you kind of partner or you're aligned with that overall best practices.
Let me just add one thing, and I don't want to take up the time for other questions, but if you're regulated by the FTC, if you're regulated by a local state agency, get on their mailing list. They are pumping out information every single day, okay? About guidelines, their thoughts, remarks from different presentations. Get on the mailing list.
That's a smart move. Agreed. Next question is how to identify or get notified with the environmental changes pertaining to third-party vendors to support continuous monitoring.
So look, there are a lot of services that are out there. There's security scorecard, there's supply wisdom, there's, a bunch of them out there. And I think it's based on your risk and criteria. It's also as an organization, right? How you monitor these, right? A lot of this information is available through, social media, Google's, but you need to be very careful, right? Because some of this information might not be accurate, right? You might have outliers or falsified information, and you do not want to take a decision without, again, proper due diligence and understanding. So one thing I strongly recommend is, especially if it's your critical vendors, really be in touch point with them on a monthly, bi-weekly, whatever the cadence that you want to set through, because the people who will know their businesses are the people who actually do this day in and day out, right? So if you have a proactive approach where you're constantly in touch with these vendors and understanding their portfolio, their risk appetite, and what they're doing in that space, I think that's one way of continuous monitoring, because you feel fairly comfortable with those vendors and how they operate. So I think that's one example I would provide. And then naturally, like I said, there's a bunch of vendors out there that you could utilize that, charge you for continuous monitoring services.
Prevalence, one of them.
Yep.
Prevalence, one of them. There you go.
Shameless plug. Shameless plug.
Financial, credit-wise, look into it.
Well earned.
Yeah.
Well earned.
Tracy, anything to add from you for this question?
No, I echo with what Alpa said about it. It really is about building trusted relationships. You will hear this word bantered about so much more now than ever. And part of that is because we're all trying to, I guess, wrangle in the benefits and utilize the resources that technology has to offer and to monetize the plethora of data that's available. You have to be in a trusted relationship with the parties that you do business with.
Yeah, I agree. I have one other question that I think is broad enough that will probably fulfill the rest of our time here, but I want to ask you both to get into your crystal ball for a second and see how you see the role of ethics, compliance, and diversity and third-party risk changing later this year or beyond.
So Tracy,
I said, Tracy, do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think we're going to see. A coalescence around standards and goals and metrics. I don't think that this is a complicated analysis. I think that it's just new, and it's a different lens through which we're all going to be expected to do business. And the market is going through, growing pains. So I think we're going to see a coalescence of standards. I think we're going to see increased regulation, particularly in the climate environment. I'm hopeful that we see more in the diversity arena. I think that it can't help but happen because of the business case now that I think is widely accepted of the added profitability resulting from increased diversity. So I think that we're going to just see a more standardized approach in this area.
And I think you're going to see, like you said, the regulations are going to be more stringent, the laws, but I think the organizations are going to be very selective who they operate their businesses with. And if you do not meet that criteria, from ethics, diversity, compliance, I think, you're not going to be in the game for very long, right? You're going to be antiquated or dinosaur effect on it. So I think, look, most organizations will have to embed this. It is the right thing to do for a society. And especially, like you said, it's going to be a lot on climate, environmental, but I think it's going to be more focused even on the poverty and human rights, right? Because of the labor laws and the impact of human trafficking, you'll see a bunch of that impact. And then, like you said, earthquakes, heat wave, water, which we know that's going to be a precious commodity. So you will see a lot more coming in. And I think people are going to be much more accountable, where they can't blame the organizations or hide behind, their supply chain management or other processes, right? It's not going to be just the bottom line. It's the bottom line plus how are you helping the society overall.
And let me just add this, with the data available out there, accountability is just so well within reach that, there's no way out. You can't just greenwash or whitewash a situation. You have to put your money where your mouth is.
Yep, times are absolutely changing and you'll need to do that. I agree. Well, thank you all so much. That's all the time we have for today. We're right at the top of the hour. I do this wrong every time. But Tracy, Alpa.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you
Yes.
for giving me an opportunity to be with the amazing panel. Tracy, it was fabulous. So thank you so much, and wishing you all to be safe.
Yes, we already got feedback of how great this was, and people are asking for the recording. So as a reminder, everyone, it is recorded. You'll get it in your inbox tomorrow. So thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.